Hey there, it's Silver. This is Graven. So now that it's finally out of early access, it's time to take a look at it. Graven is a shooter, but it's not a traditional kind of boomer shooter style of formula. Instead, it's more of like an action RPG with some shooter sensibilities in the way that almost makes it like an MSim, but it's not quite. It's a little bit hard to fully categorize, but it's an FPS with some RPG elements, basically. And the way the game is structured is that it's split into 3 episodes, each episode having a sort of town hub with NPCs, including side quests and stuff for you to explore, and a bunch of areas outside of that hub to actually go around and fight in and things, and eventually a big final boss that will culminate in the story event that takes you to the next hub in the next episode. So you are a priest in this world, and you are not really sure about the whole magic thing, and in fact, I like the fact that the journal that you use to track your quests and stuff is actually written in the first person from this priest's perspective, and it's made clear that they don't really like to use magic and they see it as kind of heretical, but because of the circumstances they don't really have a choice. So at first, most of your weapons in this game are of the physical variety, things like crossbows, ballista, things like that, but eventually you do get the ability to use a couple of spells. However, these spells aren't really for combat at first. They're more for utility and for puzzle solving. You can use them in some small combat utility, but they're kind of like level 1 plasmids from BioShock. They're not really meant to actually kill enemies, but they do have some utility in combat. But eventually you will get some more magical weapons, some books and scrolls and things that actually fire magic projectiles and things that are full-on weapons and not for puzzle solving. So the way that it works is you'll get plopped into the first hub area, and then you'll be able to explore between a couple of different sort of outer swamp and forest areas, and you'll sort of get the idea of how you're meant to explore this world pretty quickly. Each area has its own, it's almost like a self-contained dungeon, basically. And as you explore it, whether it's outdoors or indoors or underground or whatever it is, you'll find various bits of progression stuff that you'll need to keep going and eventually achieve some sort of goal. And you have as I mentioned, a really useful journal written in the first person that tells you, in general, what you're kind of supposed to be doing right now. And as well as having lots and lots of combat, the game also has a surprising amount of puzzle solving involved. And the puzzles actually, this is sort of a weird comparison, but it kind of reminds me of games like Amnesia and Penumbra a little bit, because a lot of the puzzles are very physical. You drag things around the environment and combine them to do various things. And there's also lots of, finding gears to power elevators or raise bridges, or finding levers to open doors and things like that. So there's quite a lot of variety in terms of the puzzles and a surprising focus on puzzle solving. You may go into this expecting it to be like a pure arena shooter, but it's definitely not. In terms of the game's appearance, it's got a really nice sort of chunky pixely look that has quite a lot of detail. Despite being quite pixelated, it's not lacking in world texture detail or anything like that. And the character models for the enemies especially tend to have really good animations despite being a little bit primitive looking. So it's kind of a combination of like a PS1 filtery kind of look over a much more advanced world that is clearly not from that era. And I think all the different techniques combine to make a really interesting appearance, and it uses it very well. Its aesthetic is really good in ruins and underground areas and stuff. It tends to have the best atmosphere in areas like that, and this is combined with its soundtrack and overall sound design that creates a pretty good sense of atmosphere in the sort of more dread-induced areas and the creepy underground dungeons and things. It really excels in bits like that, although its outdoor areas also have some really good ambience, especially like the sort of frozen forested area in some places like that, and the exploring around the swamp with the sound of insects and stuff in the background. It's got a nice soundscape that adds a lot of atmosphere to the overall exploration. So I think it does use its aesthetic well for the most part, and I'm never confused at what I'm looking at. This is a problem that some very heavily pixelated art styles do create, where they're going for that sort of earlier era in terms of look, your Quake kind of era. But as a result, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing, a little bit muddy as to what you're looking at, and this game does actually manage to avoid that, mostly by having a pretty vibrant color palette for the most part. There's a lot of desaturated colors, and it's a very dark fantasy, dismal world, but there's a lot of accentuated colors in certain areas that help to make things stand out that are important. Gameplay-wise, you've got your basic health and armor system that works exactly like you would think, although armor is relatively rare in this game and very valuable when you do get it. And you have a standard maximum health of 100, although there are shrines hidden around the place that can expand things like your health or your maximum stamina that you use mostly for sprinting around the place, and also your maximum mana meters, because you have a red and a blue mana. So you may be reminded of stuff like Heretic, but it works a little bit differently than that. At first, these mana gauges are used pretty much exclusively for your utility spells that you get in your book. You'll find various pages with new spells on them at certain points in the story. So you may be able to, say, light things on fire with the red mana in order to clear certain blockages in some doorways and stuff. Or you can use some blue mana to send an electrical jolt through the water to stun some enemies or to power a piece of machinery. But in addition to finding some new spells for your book, you will also eventually find some magical weapons that use these 2 mana resources as fuel, and even some alt fires for your other weapons that sometimes use them as well. You have a grid-based inventory that all of your weapons actually go into, as well as things like potions. Your ammo doesn't actually display here, but it is tracked from weapon to weapon, basically, so you do have a maximum ammo limit for each weapon ammo type. And one cool thing is the game has a pretty extensive upgrade system for your gear, so whenever you find a new weapon, you aren't just finding a new weapon that allows you to, use a new ammo type and stuff, but you're also getting what's effectively a series of upgrades, because when you go back to the hub area, you can talk to the blacksmith for some more mechanical upgrades to your weapons, and there's also an alchemist that allows you to buy some potions and do more magical upgrades for your stuff, including upgrades to your actual spells. Although some of these upgrades take a secondary resource from money called Eldritch Quills, and you can usually only find these either in super ultra out of the reach areas that are kind of difficult to find, or as drops from specific kind of optional difficult enemies like the big multi-headed ghosts. But the upgrades are very much worth saving the money for. You do have to be careful because when you die, you lose some of your money. I can't tell exactly how much, but it seems to be roughly 20% or so of the money you're currently holding, so it is smart to spend it relatively frequently because, of course, the more you have stored up, the more you lose. But you also will need to get a certain minimum amount, of course, for some of the more expensive upgrades. But you can upgrade things like special damage types for your weapons that make them more effective in certain scenarios, or adding a new alt fire that changes how you can use it, or maybe even adding some sort of extra special characteristic that allows you to, say, fire it when it's out of ammo, but using some mana as fuel in exchange. The way the game gives you weapons I find really interesting. There's basically split 50-50, where half of the weapons you get are right in front of you on the major story progression path. Like, you cannot miss them, they're right in your face, and they're basically meant to be obtained right then and there, so you will get a sort of smattering of new weapons as you go through the game. But the other half are hidden in secrets, some of which can get pretty devious. So there's basically no middle ground. Either you're given the weapon right in front of you, or you have to really search for it. And I think that's actually pretty cool, because this game has a lot of secrets to find, and it often has really good ways of rewarding you, like giving you entirely new weapons that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get a hold of. Like, just as a couple of examples, in just the first episode, you've got things like the peat thrower, which is basically a grenade launcher, and you get this later on when you get the green crystal that allows you to break certain barriers. You can get various crystals to put into your staff, a basic melee weapon that gives us some extra capabilities. And once you get this green crystal, you can find a secret that will lead you back to near where you actually started the game, but in an area that you couldn't get to before, and by doing so, you'll get a new weapon, the peat thrower. But then there's also some much more involved ones, like, for instance, the scroll that allows you to shoot these sort of shotgun blasts of green magic bolts. This one involves going to the archives area, a pretty dangerous area of the game, as far as the first episode goes, and solving a puzzle. First you gotta find the puzzle, and then you gotta find the clues to the puzzle, which are scattered throughout the level, so it's very involved just to understand what to do. And then once you do, you can solve this sliding puzzle that will give you a key that will open up an office that will have the scroll in it. So it's a multi-step process that's a lot more involved than simply breaking a wall and finding a secret. So basically what I'm saying is, the game is really good at hiding lots and lots of secrets around the place, and it often has really good stuff to reward you with for finding them. There's quite a lot of enemy variety as well, which helps. Enemies do tend to come in large waves, on the higher difficulties especially, and there will be at first just your more basic sort of shambling zombie types, but it does get more advanced from there. And what I like is that each episode has its own list of enemies, because each episode you're dealing with a different sort of cult. So the first episode you've got this bog cult that repeatedly necromances bodies and keeps them revived over and over again, so you're dealing with a lot of like necromancy based enemies, and these enemies that can keep bringing each other back. But then once you get to the second episode, you're dealing with a sort of fire cult that uses a lot of magic casters and things, and these sort of clan leader guys that can chant and cause all sorts of extra effects. And then in the third episode, you're dealing with a big desert area with these other sort of fungal enemies and some other things like that. So this means that each episode does have its own unique theme in terms of the enemies you're dealing with, because you're sort of in the territory of different cults in each episode. Then there's also a big boss fight at the end of each episode that is not bad. I don't find them to be like extremely challenging, but they are visual spectacles oftentimes, and they are at least pretty fun for the most part. So I think they do a good job of being sort of end caps for the episodes. Level design is also, of course, incredibly important in a game like this, and with a game that is as exploration heavy and puzzle solving as this game, you need good exploration to really draw the player in. And I think for the most part the game does actually succeed at having a good variety of well thought out areas with fun layouts, and of course a ton of secrets to find within them, and a lot of puzzles to solve, many of which are entirely optional. They also tend to have a lot of double backs and sealed doors and things that allow you to unlock shortcuts back to previous areas, because you're sort of meant to start from the hub each time, and it's in fact where you respawn whenever you load your save. So you're meant to sort of unlock various quick ways back between the newly explored outer dungeon areas and the hub area through stuff like lifts and doors and gates and stuff. You'll find that some areas you'll be exploring for a while, because they have several layers of puzzle that you need to solve in order to actually move on from them. And then you'll find that there are some areas that are a little bit more of like a sort of hall in between larger areas. They're sort of transitionary areas that just have a few enemies and a few areas to go and aren't particularly expansive. So you do have a variety of structure to the world, basically, where some areas are meant to be walked through only once or twice, because they're just these sort of transitionary bits between larger areas, and other areas are meant to be revisited multiple times because they'll have side quests and lots of secrets, and sometimes new enemy spawns that will repopulate them in new ways and things like that. So it's pretty involved in terms of its level design and exploration, and I think necessarily so, because of how puzzle heavy it is. You're going to be looking around these places quite often, so they need to be good, basically. And for the most part, I think it nails that pretty well. So I enjoyed the combat. It's nice and chunky, and the weapons are varied and interesting, and the upgrades are fun. I enjoyed the exploration because the areas are well varied and pretty well laid out. However, I do have some problems with the game, some pretty major ones in fact, because there is a hugely noticeable drop-off in terms of polish after the first episode. And this is sort of an unfortunate byproduct of the way that the early access worked for this game, where pretty much the entire early access campaign involved only the first episode, which means the other two haven't been tested and focused and hammered down nearly as much as the first one has. So as soon as you leave the first episode, where it's, had over a year of advice and patches and stuff to sort of give it a more nuanced take, you enter the second and third episodes, which feel a lot less polished and a lot more, I'm not going to say unfinished, but they feel like they need more attention. Some of the problems I've encountered are things like this. This is involved in the spawning behavior of the enemies. In some areas, it just does some really weird stuff. And as you'll see from that clip, those enemies were just spawning right next to me. Like, I was literally standing right there, and they just kept showing up repeatedly like some sort of clown car. And there are several areas in the later episodes that do this, where the spawning behavior for the enemies is kind of weird. And in fact, there's some other weird behaviors with it as well. Like, for instance, before I've reloaded a save and then had no enemies respawn at all, but then about halfway through a sort of dungeon area, they all decided to just pop into existence all of a sudden, including areas I both haven't been to and have been through when they were empty. Suddenly it's all populated now, and I ended up dying a couple of times because I was like surrounded by enemies that weren't just there like 5 seconds ago. And this is involved in the really weird behavior of what happens with this game when you quit and restart. So first of all, the checkpoint system in this game is really weird and I think needs a little bit of work in the later episodes. You will occasionally find these checkpoints as you're exploring around that you'll respawn at whenever you die. However, they will respawn you at these checkpoints even if they're completely surrounded by enemies or covered in acid or things like that. They'll still respawn you right there. I have died almost the instant I've respawned before because it basically respawned me inside of big, huge monsters and I got killed instantly. So there's definitely some weirdness when it comes to how it decides to respawn you, but my biggest issue with the game is, like I said earlier, what happens when you quit and reload, and it seems to like almost break the game whenever you do this, to the point that I think it actually has soft-locked me and I can't continue progressing anymore. Whatever happens to this game's world when you quit to the main menu and reload later is very messy and strange and needs some work. It will randomly open and close doors and sometimes respawn enemies and sometimes not, and sometimes respawn enemies later once you've half explored an area and then kill you because you're suddenly surrounded. Sometimes it'll respawn barricades you need to burn down and sometimes it won't. It's all really messy and hard to predict and it's extremely inconsistent, but only in the second and third episodes. The first episode doesn't really have these issues, but the latter two do. And I think honestly what's going to end up happening is a lot of people are going to start complaining about getting potentially soft-locked by how strange a lot of this behavior is. For me, what happened is early in the third episode, there's a section where you have to explore this cool cliffside temple area that has these 3 altars you need to go and destroy with your staff. And the altars are projecting this force field around a city that you need to get to progress. Destroy the 3 altars, the force field comes down, you get to go to the next area. Pretty simple. Except I destroyed the first 2 altars and then I had to quit for a reason and then come back later. So I came back later and destroyed the 3rd altar, but in between quitting and reloading, it sort of forgot what I had done and it broke the game, and now the force field won't go down and I can't progress at all. So basically it started making the first 2 altars that I had already destroyed still do the particle effect as if they weren't destroyed, but their models were still destroyed and I wasn't able to destroy them again with the staff. And so when I destroyed the 3rd and final altar, it did not update my journal like it was supposed to, and the force field didn't come down, and now I'm stuck. And I'm pretty sure I can no longer progress in the game at all on this save, because the only other directions I can go both end in sealed passageways that I can't open yet, and it looks like I open from the other side. So I need to be able to get into the city, but I can't because the force field that was supposed to go down never went down, and the story event that was supposed to trigger when I destroyed all 3 altars and it updates your journal and says that you've done it and everything never happened. And all of this is because of the really inconsistent and quite easily broken behavior that the game has whenever you quit and reload. It seems to just not be able to handle you quitting the game, and when you come back you have no idea what you're going to come back to. It's like the world sometimes completely resets itself, sometimes partially resets itself, sometimes doesn't reset at all, and there's like no consistency into what changes and what doesn't. Sometimes it even breaks pressure pads, where if you have a heavy object on a pressure plate to open up a door, you then quit and reload, the door will close itself again and only open when you take the item off of the pressure plate and make sure nothing is pressing it, and then it'll reopen again, which seems like it could potentially lock areas out if you're not careful. And I have a feeling this is maybe why you don't respawn at your various checkpoints, and instead it forces you to respawn back at the hub every time you reload a game, because the world just cannot handle being reloaded to the point that stuff constantly breaks, and the only way to give you a better chance of not being completely soft-locked is to just reset you entirely. But as I've discovered, even that doesn't always seem to work, and I'm pretty sure I did soft-lock myself. So at the end of the day, GRAVEN is a game that I want to recommend because I like what it's doing. I think it has a lot of cool ideas. I love its aesthetics, I love its atmosphere, its combat is fun, its exploration is fun, its level design is pretty good, its monster designs are pretty inspired and interesting looking. It's got a gross sort of cosmic horror, dark fantasy vibe that's really well done. But the drop-off in polish from episode 1 to episodes 2 and 3 is extremely noticeable, and it results in a relatively unstable experience that gets very buggy and difficult to predict how it's going to behave. So as of right now, I would say you should keep an eye on the patch notes for this game, because I have a feeling with how well they fixed up the first episode in early access, they're going to be doing a similar thing for the second and third episodes now that they're out and are getting more feedback on them. I have faith that they'll be able to fix a lot of these issues and make the level of polish of the second and third episodes match the first one after some time, but as of right now, it's not quite there yet. I think for the price, it's a really good game underneath all of these issues, so once they are resolved by some patches, it'll definitely be something that I can heartily recommend and say, yeah, if you enjoy action RPGs or if you enjoy some shooters with some more RPG elements and stuff in them, there's a lot to like here, and it does a lot of it pretty well. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for GRAVEN if you wish to check it out yourselves. Keep an eye on those patch notes. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.